Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, Chapter 6, Logic, further defined and divided. Encyclopedia Section 79. In point of form, logical doctrine has three sides. Alpha, the abstract side, or that of understanding. Beta, the dialectical, or that of negative reason. Gamma, the speculative, or that of positive reason. These three sides do not make three parts of logic, but are stages or moments in every logical entity, that is, of every notion and truth whatever. They may all be put under the first stage, that of understanding, and so kept isolated from each other. But this would give an inadequate conception of them. The statement of the dividing lines and the characteristic aspects of logic is at this point no more than historical and anticipatory. Encyclopedia Section 80, subsection Alpha. Thought as understanding sticks to fixity of characters and their distinctness from one another. Every such limited abstract it treats as having a subsistence and being of its own. In our ordinary usage of the term thought and even notion, we often have before our eyes nothing more than the operation of understanding. And no doubt thought is primarily an exercise of understanding. Only it goes further, and the notion is not a function of understanding merely. The action of understanding may be in general described as investing its subject matter with the form of universality. But this universal is an abstract universal. That is to say, its opposition to the particular is so rigorously maintained that it is at the same time also reduced to the character of a particular again. In this separating and abstracting attitude towards its subject, understanding is the reverse of immediate perception and sensation, which, as such, keep completely to their native sphere of action in the concrete. It is by referring to this opposition of understanding to sensation or feeling that we must explain the frequent attacks made upon thought for being hard and narrow, and for leading, if consistently developed, to ruinous and pernicious results. The answer to these charges, in so far as they are warranted by their facts, is that they do not touch thinking in general, certainly not the thinking of reason, but only the exercise of understanding. It must be added, however, that the merit and rights of the mere understanding should unhesitatingly be admitted, and that merit lies in the fact that apart from understanding, there is no fixity or accuracy in the region either of theory or of practice. Thus, in theory, knowledge begins by apprehending existing objects in their specific differences. In the study of nature, for example, we distinguish matters, forces, genera, and the like, and stereotype each in its isolation. Thought is here acting in its analytic capacity. Thought is here acting in its analytic capacity, where its canon is identity, a simple reference of each attribute to itself. It is under the guidance of the same identity that the process in knowledge is effected from one scientific truth to another. Thus, for example, in mathematics, magnitude is the feature which, to the neglect of any other, determines our advance. Hence, in geometry, we compare one figure with another, so as to bring out their identity. Similarly, in other fields of knowledge, such as jurisprudence, the advance is primarily regulated by identity. In it, we argue from one specific law or precedent to another. And what is this but to proceed on the principle of identity? But understanding is as indispensable in practice as it is in theory. Character is an essential in conduct, and a man of character is an understanding man, who is character is an essential Character is an essential in conduct, and a man of character is an understanding man, who in that capacity has definite ends in view and undeviatingly pursues them. The man who will do something great must learn, as Goethe says, to limit himself. The man who, on the contrary, would do everything, really would do nothing and fails. There is a host of interesting things in the world. Spanish poetry, chemistry, politics, and music are all very interesting. And if anyone takes an interest in them, we need not find fault. But for a person in a given situation to accomplish anything, he must stick to one definite point and not dissipate his forces in any he must stick to one definite point and not dissipate his forces in many directions. In every calling, too, the great thing is to pursue it with understanding. Thus, the judge must stick to the law and give his verdict in accordance with it, undeterred by one motive or another, allowing no excuses, and looking neither left nor right. Understanding, too, is always an element in thorough training. The trained intellect is not satisfied with cloudy and indefinite impressions, but grasps the objects in their fixed character. Whereas the uncultivated man wavers unsettled, and it often costs a deal of trouble to come to an understanding with him on the matter under discussion, and to bring him to fix his eye on the definite point in question. It has been already explained that the logical principle in general, far from being merely a subjective action in our minds, is rather the very universal which, as such, is also objective. This doctrine is illustrated in the case of understanding, the first form of logical truths. Understanding, in this larger sense, corresponds to what we call the goodness of God, so far as that means that definite things are and subsist. In nature, for example, we recognize the goodness of God in the fact that the various classes or species of animals and plants are provided with whatever they need for their preservation and welfare. Nor is man excepted, who both as an individual and as a nation possesses partly in the given circumstances of climate, of quality and products of soil, and partly in his natural parts or talents, all that is required for his maintenance and development. Under this shape, understanding is visible in every department of the objective world, and no object in that world can ever be wholly perfect, while does and no object in that world can ever be wholly perfect which does not give full satisfaction to the canons of understanding. A state, for example, is imperfect, so long as it has not reached a clear differentiation of orders and callings, and so long as those functions of politics and government, which are different in principle, have not evolved for themselves special organs. In the same way as we see, for example, the developed animal organism provided with separate organs for the function of sensation, motion, and digestion. The previous course of the discussion may serve to show that understanding is indispensable even in those spheres and regions of action which the popular fancy would deem furthest from it, and that in proportion as understanding is absent from them, imperfection is the result. This particularly holds good of art, religion, and philosophy. In art, for example, understanding is visible where the forms of beauty, which differ in principle, are kept distinct and exhibited in their purity. The same thing holds good also of single works of art. It is part of the beauty and perfection of a dramatic poem that the characters of the several persons should be closely and faithfully maintained, and that the different aims and interests involved should be plainly and decidedly exhibited. Or again, take the province of religion. The superiority of Greek over Northern mythology, apart from other differences of subject matter and conception, mainly consists in this: that in the former the individual gods are fashioned into forms of sculpture like distinctness of outline, while in the latter the figures fade away vaguely and hazily into one another. Lastly comes philosophy, that philosophy never can get on without the understanding hardly calls for special remark after what has been said. It its foremost requirement is that every thought shall be grasped in its full precision, and nothing allowed to remain vague and indefinite. It is usually added that understanding must not go too far, which is so far correct that understanding is not an ultimate, but on the contrary finite, and so constituted that when carried to extremes, it veers round to its opposite. It is the fashion of youth to dash about in abstractions, but the man who has learnt to know life steers clear of the abstract either or, and keeps to the concrete. Encyclopedia section 81, subsection beta. In the dialectical stage, these finite characterizations or formulae supersede themselves and, and pass into their opposites. Infrasection 1. But when the dialectical principle is employed by the understanding separately and independently, especially as seen in its application to philosophical theories, dialectic becomes skepticism, in which the result that ensues from its action is presented as a mere negation. Infrasection 2. It is customary to treat dialectic as an adventitious art, or an adventitious art, which for very wantonness introduces confusion and a mere semblance of contradiction into definite notions. And in that light, the semblance is the nonentity, while the true reality is supposed to belong to the original dicta of understanding. Often, indeed, dialectic is nothing more than a subjective seesaw of arguments pro and con, where the absence of sterling thought is distinguished by the subtlety which gives birth to such arguments. But in its true and proper character, dialectic is the very nature and essence of everything predicated by mere understanding. The law of things and of the finite as a whole. Dialectic is different from reflection. In the first instance, reflection is that movement out beyond the isolated predicate of a thing which gives it some reference and brings out its relativity, while still in other respects leaving it its isolated validity. But by dialectic is meant the indwelling But by dialectic is meant the indwelling tendency outwards by which the one sidedness and limitation of the predicates of understanding is seen in its true light and shown to be the negation of them. For anything to be finite is just to suppress itself and put itself aside. By But by dialectic is meant the indwelling tendency outwards by which the one sidedness and limitation of the predicates of understanding is seen in its true light and shown to be the negation of them. For anything to be finite is just to suppress itself and put itself aside. Thus understood, the dialectical principle constitutes the life and soul of scientific progress, the dynamic which alone gives immanent connection and necessity to the body of science, and, in a word, is seen to constitute the real and true, as opposed to the external exaltation above the finite. Meta intersection 1 of intersection 2, meta intersection 1 of intersection 2. It is of the highest importance to ascertain and understand rightly the nature of dialectic. Wherever there is movement, wherever there is life, wherever anything is carried into effect in the actual world, there dialectic is at work. It is also the soul of all knowledge which is truly scientific. In the popular way of looking at things, the refusal to be bound by the abstract deliverances of understanding appears as fairness, which, according to the proverb, live and let live, demands that each should have its turn. We admit the one, but we admit the other also. But when we look more closely, we find that the limitations of the finite do not merely come from without, that its own nature is the cause of its abrogation, in that by its own act it passes into its counterpart. We say, for instance, that man is mortal, and seem to think that the ground of his death is in external circumstances only, so that if this way of looking were correct, man would have two special properties, vitality and also mortality. But the true view of the matter is that life, as life, involves the germ of death, and that the finite, being radically self contradictory, involves its own self suppression. Nor again is dialectic to be confounded with mere sophistry. The essence of sophistry lies in giving authority to a partial and abstract principle, in its isolation, as may suit the interest and particular situation of the individual at the time. For example, a regard to my existence, and my having the means of existence is a vital motive of conduct. But if I exclusively emphasize this consideration or motive of my welfare, and draw the conclusion that I may steal or betray my country, we have a case of sophistry. Similarly, it is a vital principle in conduct that I should be subjectively free. That is to say, that I should have an insight into what I am doing. and a conviction that it is right. But if my pleading insists on this principle alone, I fall into sophistry, such as would overthrow all the principles of mortality. Uh, but if my pleading insists on this principle alone, I fall into sophistry, such as would overthrow all the principles of my morality. From this sort of party pleading, dialectic is wholly different. It, its purpose is to study things in their own being and movement, and thus to demonstrate the finitude of the partial categories of understanding. Dialectic, it may be added, is no novelty in philosophy. Among the ancients, divine Plato is termed the inventor of dialectic, and his right to the name rests on the fact that the Platonic philosophy first gave the free scientific, and thus at the same time the objective, form to dialectic. Socrates, as we should expect from the general character of his philosophizing, has the dialectical element in a predominantly subjective shape, that of irony. He used to turn his dialectic first against ordinary consciousness, and then especially against the sophists. In his conversations, he used to simulate the wish for some clearer knowledge about the subject under discussion, and after putting all sorts of questions with that intent, he drew on those with whom he conversed to the opposite of what their first impressions had pronounced correct. If, for instance, the sophists claimed to be teachers, Socrates, by a series of questions, forced the sophist's Protagoras to confess that all learning is only recollection. In his more strictly scientific dialogues, divine Plato employs the dialectical method to show the finitude of all hard and fast terms of understanding. Thus, in the Parmenides, he deduces the many from the one, and shows nevertheless that the many cannot but define itself as the one. In this grand style did divine Plato treat dialectic. In modern times, it was, more than any other, Kant who resurrected the name of dialectic and restored it to its post of honor. He did it, as we have seen, see Encyclopedia section 48, by working out the antinomies of the reason. The problem of these antinomies is no mere subjective piece of work oscillating between one set of grounds and another. It really serves to show that every abstract proposition of understanding, taken precisely as it is given, naturally veers round into its opposite. However reluctant, understanding may be to admit the action of dialectic, we must not suppose that the recognition of its existence is peculiarly confined to the philosopher. It would be truer to say that dialectic gives expression to a law which is felt in all other grades of consciousness and in general experience. Everything that surrounds us may be viewed as an instance of dialectic. We are aware that everything finite, instead of being stable and ultimate, is rather changeable and transient. And this is exactly what we mean by that dialectic of the finite. And this is exactly what we mean by that dialectic of the finite, by which the finite, as implicitly other than what it is forced beyond its own immediate and natural being to turn suddenly into its opposite. We have before this, see section, Encyclopedia section 80, we have before this identified understanding with what is implied in the popular idea of the goodness of God. We may now remark of dialectic in the same objective signification that its principle answers to the idea of his power. All things, we say, that is the finite world as such are doomed, and in saying so, we have a vision of dialectic as the universal and irresistible power before which nothing can stay, however secure and stable it may deem itself. The category of power does not, it is true, exhaust the depth of the divine nature or the notion of God, but it certainly forms a vital element in all religious consciousness. Apart from this general objectivity of dialectic, we find traces of its presence in each of the particular provinces and phases of the natural and the spiritual world. Take as an illustration the motion of the heavenly bodies. At this moment, the planet stands in this spot, but implicitly it is the possibility of being in another spot, and that possibility of being otherwise, the planet brings into existence by moving. Similarly, the physical elements prove to be dialectical. The process of meteorological action is the exhibition of their dialectic. It is the same dynamic that lies at the root of every other natural process, and as it were, forces nature out of itself. To illustrate the presence of dialectic in the spiritual world, especially in the provinces of law and morality, we have only to recollect how general experience shows us the extreme of one state or action suddenly shifting into its opposite, a dialectic which is recognized in many ways in common proverbs. Thus,
Summum ius summa injuria.
the supreme law of the highest injury, as translated by Google, and here in William Wallace's Hegel, which means that to drive an abstract right to its extremity is to do it wrong. In political life, as everyone knows, extreme anarchy and extreme despotism naturally lead to one another. The perception of dialectic in the province of individual ethics is seen in the well-known adages. Pride comes from Pride comes before a fall. Too much wit outwits itself. Even feeling, bodily as well as mental, has its dialectic. Everyone knows how the extremes of pain and pleasure pass into each other. The heart overflowing with joy seeks relief in tears, and the deepest melancholy will at times betray its presence by a smile. Encyclopedia section 81, subsection beta, infrasection 2, meta infrasection 2. Skepticism should not be looked upon merely as a doctrine of doubt. It would be more correct to say that the skeptic has no doubt of his point, which is the nothingness of all finite existence. He who only doubts still clings to the hope that his doubt may be resolved, and that one or other of the definite views between which he wavers will turn out solid and true. Skepticism, properly so called, is a very different thing. It is complete hopelessness about all which understanding counts stable, and the feeling to which it gives birth is one of unbroken calmness and inward repose. Such at least is the noble skepticism of antiquity, especially as exhibited in the writings of Sextus Empiricus, when in the later times of Rome it had been systematized as a complement to the dogmatic systems of Stoic and Epicurean. A far other stamp, and to be strictly distinguished from it, is the modern skepticism already mentioned in Encyclopedia section 39, which partly preceded the critical philosophy and partly sprung out of it. That later skepticism consisted solely in denying the truth and certitude of the supersensible and in pointing to the facts of sense and of immediate sensation as what we have to keep to. Even to this day, skepticism is often spoken of as the irresistible enemy of all positive knowledge, and hence of philosophy, insofar as philosophy is concerned with positive knowledge. But in these statements, there is a misconception. It is only the finite thought of abstract understanding which has to fear skepticism, because unable to withstand it, philosophy includes the skeptical principle as a subordinate function of its own in the shape of dialectic. In contradistinction to mere skepticism, however, philosophy does not remain content with the purely negative result of dialectic. The skeptic mistakes the true value of his result when he supposes it to be no more than a negation pure and simple, for for the negative, which emerges as the result of dialectic, is because a result at the same time positive. It contains what it results from, absorbed into itself and made part of its own nature. Thus conceived, however, the dialectical stage has the features characterizing the third grade of logical truth, the speculative form or form of positive reason. Encyclopedia section 82, subsection gamma. The speculative stage or stage of positive reason apprehends the unity of terms, propositions, in their opposition, the affirmative which is involved in their disintegration and in their transition. And for section number 1, the result of dialectic is positive because it has a definite content, or because it results or because its results is not empty and abstract nothing, but the negation of certain specific propositions which are contained in the result for the very reason that it is a resultant and not an immediate nothing. And for section number 2, it follows from this that the reasonable result, though it be only a thought in abstract, is still a concrete, being not a plain formal unity, but a unity of distinct propositions. Bare abstractions or formal thoughts are therefore no business of philosophy, which has to deal only with concrete thoughts. And for section number 3, the logic of mere understanding is involved in speculative logic and can at will be elicited from it by the simple process of omitting the dialectical and reasonable element. When that is done, it becomes what the common logic is, a descriptive collection of sundry thoughts, forms, and rules which, finite though they are taken to be something infinite. If we consider only what it contains and not how it contains and not how it contains it, the true reason world, so far from being the exclusive property of philosophy, is the right of every human being on whatever grade of culture or mental growth he may stand, which would justify man's ancient title of rational being. The general mode by which experience first makes us aware of the reasonable order of things is by accepted and unreasoned belief, and the character of the rational, as already noted in Encyclopedia section 45, is to be unconditioned and thus to be self contained, self determining. In this sense, man above all things becomes aware of the reasonable order when he knows of God and knows him to be the completely self determined. Similarly, the consciousness a citizen has of his country and its laws is a perception of the reason world so long as he looks up to them as unconditioned and likewise universal powers to which he must subject his individual will. And in the same sense, the knowledge and will of the child is rational when he knows his parents' will and wills it. Now, to turn these rational, of course, positively rational realities into speculative principles, the only thing needed is that they be thought. The expression speculation in common life is often used with a very vague and at the same time secondary sense as when we speak of a matrimonial or a commercial speculation. By this, we only mean two things. First, that what is immediately at hand has to be passed and left behind, and secondly, that the subject matter of such speculations, though in the first place only subjective, must not remain so, but be realized or translated into objectivity. What was some time ago remarked respecting the idea may be applied to this common usage of the term speculation, and we may add that people who rank themselves amongst the educated expressly speak of speculation even as if it were something purely subjective. A certain theory of some conditions and circumstances of nature or mind may be, say these people, very fine and correct as a matter of speculation. But it contradicts experience, and nothing of the sort is admissible in reality. To this answer is that the speculative is in its true form. To this, the answer is that the speculative is in its true signification neither primarily nor even definite. To this, the answer is that the speculative is in its true signification neither preliminarily nor even definitively something merely subjective, that on the contrary it expressly rises above such oppositions as that between subjective and objective, which the understanding cannot get over, and absorbing them in itself, evinces its own concrete and all embracing nature. A one sided proposition, therefore, can never even give expression to a speculative truth. If we say, for example, that the absolute is the unity of subjective and objective, we are undoubtedly in the right, but so far one sided as we enunciate the unity only and lay the accent upon it, forgetting that in reality the subjective and objective are not merely identical but also distinct. Speculative truth, it may also be noted, means very much the same as what in special connection with religious experience and doctrines used to be called mysticism. The term mysticism is at present used as a rule to designate what is mysterious and incomprehensible, and in proportion as their general culture and way of thinking vary, the epithet is applied by one class to denote the real and the true, by another to name everything connected with superstition and deception. On which we first of all remark that there is mystery in the mystical, only however for the understanding which is ruled by the principle of abstract identity, whereas the mystical as synonymous with the speculative is the concrete unity of those propositions, which understanding only accepts in their separation and opposition. And if those who recognize mysticism as the highest truth are content to leave it in its original, utter mystery, their conduct only proves for them too, as well as for their antagonists, thinking means abstract identification, and that in their opinion, therefore, truth can only be won by renouncing thought, or as it is frequently expressed, by leading the reason captive. But as we have seen, the abstract thinking of understanding is so far from being either ultimate or stable that it shows a perpetual tendency to work its own dissolution and swing round into its opposite. Reasonableness, on the contrary, just consists in embracing within itself these opposites as unsubstantial elements. Thus, the reason world may be equally styled mystical, and, however, because thoughts cannot both reach and comprehend it, but merely because it lies beyond the compass of understanding. Encyclopedia section 83. Encyclopedia section 83. Logic is subdivided into three parts. Part 1, the doctrine of being. Part 2, the doctrine of essence. Part 3, the doctrine of notion and idea. That is, into the theory of thought. Part 1, in its immediacy, the notion implicit and in germ. Part 2, in its reflection and mediation, the being for self and show of the notion. Part 3, in its return into itself and its developed abiding by itself, the notion in and for itself. The division of logic now given, as well as the whole of the previous discussion on the nature of thought, is anticipatory, and the justification or proof of it can only result from the detailed treatment of thought itself. For in philosophy, to prove means to show how the subject, by and from itself, makes itself what it is. The relation in which these three leading grades of thought or of the logical idea stand to each other must be conceived as follows. Truth comes only with the notion, or more precisely, the notion is the truth of being and essence, both of which, when separately maintained in their isolation, cannot but be untrue. The former because it is exclusively immediate, and the latter because it is exclusively mediate. Why, then, it may be asked, begin with the false and not at once with the true? To which we answer that truth, to deserve the name, must authenticate its own truth. With authentication, to which we answer, why, then, it may be asked, begin with the false and not at once with the true? To which we answer that truth, to deserve the name, must authenticate its own truth. With authentication, here within the sphere of logic is given when the notion demonstrates itself to be what is mediated by and with itself, and thus at the same time to be truly immediate. This relation between the three stages of the logical idea appears in a real and concrete shape. Thus, God, who is the truth, is known by us in his truth, that is, as absolute spirit, only insofar as we at the same time recognize that the world which he created, nature and the finite spirit, are in their difference from God untrue. End of chapter 6. An addendum. So there's a famous phrase, since we speak about God, that the devil is a lie. Why is the devil a lie? Because, as Jesus Christ, the great philosopher, who I consider to be Ganymede, the son of Zeus and Hera, father and mother, but of course you have your own theology, the devil is a lie because Jesus said he is the prince of this world, and the prince of this world is synonymous with the world itself. L'état moi, King Louis the 14th said. So if God, who is the truth, is known by us in his truth, that is, as absolute spirit, only insofar as we at the same time recognize that the world which he created, nature and the finite spirit, are in their difference from God untrue. And so, therefore, the devil is a created being, and he is only opposite of God in that we are trying to establish a difference. And as all finite things is untrue. So, as nature and the finite spirit in relation to God are untrue, the devil, which is a finite spirit, is also untrue or a lie. So, the devil is a lie.